Good day. I'm Vincent Saxtetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 26, recorded on January 17th, 2026. This episode is Genetic Improvement of Plant Harvests, Why It's Hard. Why it's hard to improve the plant harvests using genetics. This is a prepping channel, but it's not your average prepping channel. This channel is about the last 250 years of multiplying our consumption of everything every 22 years or so, and and we're coming to the end of that, so I'm talking here about how that it's going to end and what the end will look like, and how to prep for what comes next, how to prepare yourself so that the end won't come in a year. This is not about prepping for things that happen in a month or a year. This is about prepping for a huge change, much larger than any of those things, and much more profound, that will affect all of us much more deeply as we come to a point where we are no longer able to multiply our consumption of everything every generation, and where we'll have a little less energy than we have now, maybe a half or a third of the energy that we have now. Right now we have 46,000 calories per person per day of energy, plus another 15,000 of food, fodder, and wood. And so we'll have a bit less than that sometime in the next 50 or 100 years. And we can't continue providing that much energy for ourselves. So how to prepare yourself so that 30 or 50 years from now you have better chances of having a good life and of flourishing, but also how to prepare your family line so that your family line is likely to continue and to flourish in the new world that's coming, where we'll still have many of the same technologies, and we'll still be consuming a lot more than our ancestors 200 years ago did, but a bit less than today. So how to thrive and flourish in the new world. So right now we've been looking at how much energy we can get from different sources, and trying to nail down how much we're likely to be able to have for ourselves long term, per person per day. And we already looked at coal, oil, and gas, and then at other sources like wind, solar, and nuclear. And then right now we're in the middle of a sequence about how much energy we could get from the world's plants and forests and crops. And so right now we're in episode 26. Episodes 22 through 25, we're just talking about the energy harvest of the world's plants, and how it works, how the plants do their harvesting, and where they lose energy. So out of 300 calories that come from the sun, the world's plants harvest 1. Turn that into dry plant material, or wet plant material. Anyway, 1 out of 300 calories is harvested, and we get 1 out of 11 of the harvested calories. So if you divide how much sunlight is coming into the earth every day, and divide that among the world's inhabitants, that would be around 6 million calories per person per day. But the world's plants harvest only 170,000 calories, 60 million calories, not 6 million calories are coming in, and the world's plants harvest 170,000, and we get 15,000 calories of food, fodder, and wood. So that factor of 300 energy loss divides into three sectors. The first one is a factor of 5 energy loss that's caused by the fact that not all of the world's land is the best land. That was episode 22. Then episode 23 was the difference between the world's best land and what happens in a lab. And lab plants do 3 times better. So that's a factor of 3 in addition, but then there's 20 left, a factor of 20 left. Even in a lab, only 1 out of 20 calories is harvested. And that was episodes 24 and 25 about what happens inside of plants that causes only 1 out of 20 calories to be harvested from sunlight. And so now in this episode, in the next one, we're talking again about what happens inside of the plant, but now we're shifting our focus to how we could possibly improve that and how much we could expect to improve that. And then after this episode and the next, we'll have another couple episodes about how we could improve plants' the environment around plants, their land and their water and so on, and to help with the factor of 5 that's lost by not living on the world's best land. So this episode and the next will be about the factor of 20 energy loss inside of a plant and what we could do to improve it using breeding and genetics. And then the next couple episodes after that will be about what we could do for the world's land to help our cropland too, to help our cropland give a better harvest. And at that point we'll be done. There's nothing to be done about the difference between a lab and farmland, because the fact is we can't turn the world's farmland or the world's forests into laboratories. Just impossible. So once we've covered the plant internals and the difference and how much we can improve the world's land, then we'll be done with examining what we could do for the world's plants, and we'll finally have a picture of how much we could harvest from the world's plants long term. Now, already we know from the previous discussion that the best possible improvement that we could do for that factor of 20 energy loss inside of the world's plants is improve it to a factor of 10. That's just the absolute theoretical limit. It's not going to happen because it would involve a million things working perfectly. But it's easy to see that the best you could do is improve it by a factor of 2. This is for plants in a lab. Now, outside a lab, maybe we could do better because plants are losing, outside of a lab, they lose because they don't live on the world's best land, most of them, and they encounter weather and pests and droughts and so on, and because of that, they lose more than a factor of 20. They lose a factor of 100 on average, and maybe we could do something about that by improving plants' ability to handle droughts or poor soil. So I'll be examining that in this episode and the next a bit. But overall, I'll just tell you now the end result of the discussion now and in the next episode. Is that in general we aren't going to get very big improvements, nowhere near a factor of 2, by working on plant internals, working on genetics. It'll be slow going, it'll take a lot of effort and a lot of risk, a lot of time, and it'll be hard to do, and probably in my opinion is that we'll get better results if we want to do something about plants' ability to deal with poor soils. We'll generally get better results by improving the soil than by improving the plant's ability to deal with it. Maybe we can improve. Suppose you have sandy soil. Maybe we can improve a plant's ability to thrive in sandy soil, but we'll get even better improvements and with less effort by improving the soil so it's not so sandy. So I'm not against working on breeding plants, for instance, to be able to handle sandy soil. I'm just saying that overall we're likely to get more benefit by improving the soil than by working on the genetics. But there's some room for improvement, so it's worth talking about. So in this current episode, I'm going to be talking about why it's hard to improve plant internals, at least as far as their ability to harvest sunlight, to improve their efficiency in improving sunlight, to improve their efficiency in harvesting sunlight. And in the next episode, I'll talk about where we stand now in scientific research efforts, what we're looking at, and what we've tried, and how that's going. So a status. So this episode is about why it's hard. The next episode is about our status, and I'll wind up with some overall opinions about the ethics and morality of the whole endeavor. And I'll be trying, in the next episode, I'll be trying to give a tour of basically an overview, a fairly complete overview of what scientists are trying to improve. The long term, and then the outcome of this episode, of these next 4 episodes, the 2 episodes about plant internals, and then 2 episodes about improving the world's land. Overall, the final answer is that I think that even a factor of 2 improvement in our harvest, say from 15,000 to 30,000 calories per person per day, even if we spent a large fraction of our population working on this improvement, and we kept on working on it for the next 100 to 200 years, it still seems like a factor of 2 seems like a stretch. So I doubt that we're going to improve our portion of the world's harvest from 15,000 to 30,000 in the next century or 2. So I think that we can improve it substantially, but a factor of 2 seems far-fetched. So, but we'll come to that. And we'll be talking about the details of what we could do genetically, and then to the world's land. So now, so let's get into the meat of today's episode. It's about why it's hard to improve a plant to harvest more energy. And I want to start by saying that when I discussed the energy loss, we've just gone through several episodes talking about the 1 out of 300 energy loss that plants have, that they lose 299 out of 300 calories. We concentrated on just energy flow, the energy that comes from the sun, it hits the Earth's surface, and then what happens next. And we were just thinking about energy and about nothing else. We were really obsessed. We had a narrow vision of plants, and it allowed us to say something in a few episodes. But the fact is, lots of other things are important to plants besides energy flow. Okay, and they have to get an awful lot of things right besides just harvesting energy, like how they handle the weather, how long they last before they rot, and things like that, how they reproduce. You can go on and make quite a long list of other things that are essential to a plant's survival, and we were just focused on energy. And so we have a very narrow focus, and we get a very narrow vision, one that allows us to say something in a finite amount of time. If we were to really try to cover all that a plant needs to do in order to stay alive and reproduce, we would be here for years. Okay, and that would be the province of somebody else besides myself, somebody who's a full-time plant scientist. But I wanted to get to the bottom of where the energy goes, and luckily, by focusing only on energy, as some scientists have done, I was able to summarize it for you in a few episodes. So, for example, so because we have a narrow focus, if we propose some improvement to plants' energy efficiency, some idea we have of how plants might improve their energy harvest, we're flying blind about all the other things that might be affected by our suggested improvement. There's all sorts of other things that matter to a plant, and any proposal that we make to improve energy, to improve the harvest, may and most likely will interfere with the other things the plant needs to get done. This is a huge problem, and let me give just one example. Actually, I'm going to give two, but the first example would be whether a leaf, whether the plant's leaves are vertical, in other words, the leaves go basically straight up, or whether they're horizontal, going sideways, or some angle in between. Obviously, this is a simplified picture that there's one single angle to the plant's leaves, because leaves do tend to curve, and there are many leaves, and different leaves will be at different angles, and also the angle may change depending on whether the plant is young or old, or depending on whether the plant is adjusting to water loss or whether it has plenty of water. Its leaves may wilt, and just to simplify the discussion, let's just talk about whether plants are vertical or horizontal or in between. Okay. Now, in general, if you want a good energy harvest, and you want to minimize the amount of work that the plant does to get that energy harvest, then the leaves would be vertical or very close to vertical. They'd be pointing towards the sun. And why is that? It's because if the sun's up here at noonday and it's shining down, the sunlight is coming down toward the leaf, it'll get spread along the whole leaf and along many leaves. So every leaf along the stalk of your plant will be getting the sun. Okay, and so you'll be spreading the energy flow across many parts, many leaves, and no one leaf will get overwhelmed by too much sun, and they'll be able to cooperate in getting things done. Okay. So if you're just thinking about energy flow and about doing the best energy harvest, you'll be tempted to have the leaves, and you want to design a plant to get the best energy harvest. You'll be tempted to have the leaves be somewhere close to vertical. Okay. But there are also other things you have to balance against that if you do make the leaves vertical, may interfere with the plant's ability to function, and actually you may get a worse harvest from the plant. So here are some reasons why you might want to keep the leaves not vertical but horizontal. So first of all, the plant wants to should protect its soil, and so it would want to cover the soil and preserve it, so it keep it moist, so that water is essential to the plant's growth. So a plant would need to keep the soil moist, not let water escape. A good way to do that is to cover the soil with leaves, and with its leaves like an umbrella, and keep it cool. And that would also prevent erosion. It would prevent too much wind blowing the soil around. It would mean the soil wouldn't get baked, and often there are always there are living things inside the soil that plants depend on to help it grow. Animals and bacteria and fungi in the soil that aid the plant in getting its nutrients and help the plant grow. That even can function as extensions to its root system, and in order to keep those things alive, you want to keep the soil cool and protected from the sun. So those are all reasons why you would want why a plant might benefit from not having its leaves going straight up and down, and not to mention that that the plant itself can be protected by having horizontal leaves. The horizontal leaves will keep the air moist around the plant, which it needs, and will reduce the wind around the plant. So these are, so if we focus only on energy flow in a very narrow focus as we've been doing, we'll just have our leaves plant vertically, our plant's leaves be vertical, but in fact that might completely destroy its harvest or keep the plant from growing at all. So this is a generic problem. It's not just about leaf angle. All aspects of a plant, you may think, okay, this is what the plant should be like to get the ideal harvest if you're just looking narrowly at energy, but then you have to think about 1,000 other factors that will affect that same thing. Another thing that if we're thinking about leaf angle, so far I was just talking about a single plant's leaves and the angle of those leaves. You also have to think about what happens when you have a plant growing in a field, say a wheat plant growing in a field next to a bunch of other wheat plants, and the ideal placement of its leaves and angle of its leaves will change depending on how many other wheat plants there are, how close they are together, and what size they are. So the plants will grow considerably differently in the presence of neighbors than when they're alone. And so we have to consider that too. So I don't just need to think about all the processes that go into a single plant's life. I have to think about all the other plants in the crop on the field, and what's the ideal for all of them together. And all this means is that if I want to improve the energy harvest, it's not just a matter of thinking about energy flow and seeing what I can do to improve the energy flow. I have to think about many other processes all at the same time and improve them all at once. So, in fact, so for instance, and I'll give a third example. Suppose I think, okay, well the goal is, after all, I want to harvest energy, so I want a bigger plant. I want the plant to grow bigger. Okay. And this can actually give me a worse harvest. Okay. The reason why it could give you a worse harvest is because plants don't just need sunlight and energy because I'm harvesting grain. I'm not harvesting just the whole plant. I'm harvesting grain, and what I care about is grain, and it can easily happen that I get a bigger plant, but because the plant is bigger, I get less grain. The way it works is that a plant needs nitrogen in order to grow, in order to produce grain. Grain contains a lot of nitrogen. It comes in fertilizer. It comes from the ground, but nitrogen is also used to produce the structure of the plant. So the structure includes some nitrogen too. So if I get a bigger plant, the structure, there's more nitrogen embedded in the structure of the plant, and that's great during the growth phase of the plant. During the growth phase, the plant is storing up energy and storing up nitrogen, and then later, as it slows down its growth, it starts to transfer its nitrogen and its energy into grain. And if the soil has a limited amount of nitrogen, it has already absorbed all, then it has a fixed amount of nitrogen, but it's already taken all of that nitrogen and put it into its plant structure, into the stuff that keeps the leaves and stalk erect and so on. Its backbone, so to speak, and then and it's unable, because you have a bigger plant, there's more structure to your plant, and that structure required more nitrogen, and it's not able to, the structure isn't able to liberate its nitrogen in order to give it to grain, so the grain gets less nitrogen, and so you get less grain. So overall, the point is that if you have a fixed amount of nitrogen in the soil, and you breed a plant, or you engineer a plant to grow bigger, okay, because it's grown bigger, it'll use that nitrogen not for producing grain, but for producing the structure of the plant. And the plant will look great while the plant is during the growth phase, okay, but late in the season, when it's time for the plant to for its leaves to stop harvesting so much sunlight and for it to start transferring energy from its storage into grain, it won't be able to store. It'll have energy to give to the grain, but it won't have nitrogen to give to the grain, because that nitrogen is locked up in the stalk and in the leaves. So it can happen it can easily happen, very easily happen, that you do something that seems obvious. You'll get a better harvest because you've got a bigger plant, but actually it can work out reverse. Okay. So, and in fact, this is the rule, not the exception. Our work on improving plants over the last 60 years has only very rarely increased the plant's real harvest. So, in fact, and I'll talk. I'll explain in a few details about that in the next couple minutes. But like, just there's, and in particular for genetically oriented work, where somebody was thinking about genes and how to improve them either by breeding or by genetic engineering. People have been thinking about this for some 50 years, and so far there's really no convincing demonstration of a positive effect in the harvest, but in a gene-focused research effort. So people have been trying to do gene-focused research to improve the harvest, and they've tried it over and over again, scientists all over the world, and they're just not coming up with good examples where they actually succeeded. There's some problem, and I'll explain why. Why it's difficult when you're focusing on genes specifically as your main, all your attention's there to come up with a good improvement in the actual plant harvest. Okay, so you might say, well, what about the Green Revolution in the 1960s? You've probably heard of that. That's after World War II. There were a series of technological improvements that allowed us to get more grain from our grain cropland, and it made a big difference to our ability to feed the world in the 60s and 70s, and since then. Genetically, what we did to make that happen was we took rice and wheat, okay, and we weren't really gene focused, okay. We weren't thinking about which specific genes, and we didn't know which specific genes were involved in this yet. But in Japan, the Japanese had already come across a breed of wheat that grew short. It was stunted. It was half the height of the rice that was grown elsewhere. And we turned that into a product that we could spread around the world. Today's rice and wheat is half the height of what it used to be 60 or 70 years ago. We grow dwarf rice and dwarf wheat. Or another very accurate way of saying it is it's stunted, okay? And we do that deliberately because it gives us more grain. Now, the reason why the plant itself is not as healthy, there's less of the plant, okay? It's smaller, okay? But because there's less of the plant, it's able to put more of the sunlight energy and more of its fertilizer, more of the nutrients into the grain. So we get more grain, more rice, more wheat from the plant, even though the plant itself is smaller and less healthy. And also it has less roots, so there's more erosion. And these plants are not as good at getting nitrogen from the soil as they were before we introduced these stunted varieties. so they need more fertilizer. So with the Green Revolution, we didn't just didn't start farming stunted wheat and rice. We also started pouring nitrogen and other fertilizer all over the soil. And you may have heard that well, first of all, nitrogen fertilizer requires coal generally to power the plants that produce the nitrogen fertilizer. So this only works if you have coal to burn, or gas or something to burn to produce the fertilizer. And also the nitrogen doesn't stay on the farmland. It spreads through the water and does interesting things to the rivers and the waterways and also to the land. So it has side effects when you pour this amount of nitrogen over the land. So we improved, in that case, we were able to improve our harvest from wheat and rice, okay? But we didn't actually improve the plant itself. The plant itself is less healthy, and the cropland is worse off. Okay? And then that was actually a success story for us, okay, where we got a better harvest. But most stories didn't work out even that well. Okay, there are many cases where we, quote, improved a plant, okay, but our harvest did not improve. So, for instance, there's a scientific study where we worked on the leaves, the photosynthesis and the rubisco and so on inside of soybean leaves, and we were able to show clearly and clear experimental evidence that the leaves of the soybean plant, the individual leaves, were doing a better job of harvesting energy. In this case, it was done using breeding, not genetic engineering. But even though the leaves themselves were doing better, the plant as a whole didn't give any different harvest. So, and that's because you don't just need a plant's leaves to be harvesting more sunlight. You have to have all sorts of things working together inside the plant to produce that final larger number of soybeans or more of them, or larger soybeans. You have to improve the whole plant if you want to get a better harvest. Now the Green Revolution, where we produced stunted plants and got more rice and more wheat from them, was one where we didn't precisely understand which genes were involved. Instead, we were looking at whether the plants were short or not, which is easy enough to judge by eye. Okay. Now you might think that now we in the last decades have been able to start figuring out exactly what genes are inside of a plant or inside of a human, so we are able to sequence all the genes inside of a plant and understand precisely what they are. Okay, and we can alter genes now. We can do gene modification. You might think that now it would be a simple matter to improve plants, and I want to tell you why it's not. Why altering individual genes and our ability to measure, to see them, to sequence them, and to change them actually doesn't really make our life a lot easier. And I'll start by saying that individual tasks, like a plant's decisions about what angle its leaves will be at, or how to handle water usage, or many of all of the major tasks that a plant does, okay, these tasks generally any one of these tasks require many genes to work together. It's as if the DNA in a plant were a large library, okay, and in order to figure out the leaf placement, for instance, you wouldn't go to one place in the library. Instead, you'd have to pick out 30 books from different places and look at a specific page in each book, and from far apart in the library. and all of those many genes would go together to determine how the leaves are placed. And it's hard for us to figure out which 20 genes go into determining leaf placement, how they combine, and how they work together to get the job done. So in general, if we have something that requires 20 genes to make it happen, if we fiddle with one or two at a time, just fiddling with one or two at a time will give us a worse result. So you have to not change one or two, you have to change 10 at a time, and then if you know what you're doing, which we don't, then maybe you can get a better or a different answer for the leaf placement. Otherwise, maybe you just won't get leaves at all, or they'll be completely crooked. Another problem is that even though we're able to sequence all the genes in a plant very easily, we don't know what most of those genes are for. We still don't. Genes are labeled by saying, well, we think, even in humans, we think this has to do with your height or something, or your eye color, or, okay, but because you can do correlations, you can look at a human's or a plant's say a plant's height and so on, and you can say, okay, well, the height changed and which genes changed, okay, or but even if you know what a gene affects, okay, even then we may know very little or nothing about how it manages to affect that, how it manages to get a particular thing done. So we can say, okay, maybe we can get to a point where we have a list of 30 genes that determine leaf placement, okay, the leaf angle or whatever. But then how any one of those genes does what it does, how its presence results in the leaf being at a certain angle, it requires a lot of extra work, and in most cases we just haven't done that work. It's extremely challenging to keep track of all the thousands and thousands of genes in the first place, and then figuring out the chemistry and the mechanics and so on of how they have the consequences that they have is another matter. So, and in fact, to make things worse, is most genes have several purposes and several effects. So, a gene that affects leaf placement may also affect the plant height, or how many branches it has, or how fast it grows, or all of those. So I can't, while I'm trying to work on understanding leaf placement, I'm getting dragged into a million other things that the plant does, and if I try to change a gene to change the leaf placement, okay, then it may affect any number of other things at the same time. So overall, even though we know a huge amount more than we did 20 years ago before gene sequencing, maybe 30 years ago, about plants, and we have so much more control. Still, it hasn't given us that much insight into saying, well, if I change this gene, this will be the effect, and picking which gene to change and how much to change it. Okay. Then there's another problem, which is that genes are many steps removed from the final harvest. So you could have a very big genetic change, like we talked about the rubisco protein, which harvests carbon dioxide. You could change a gene so that the plant produces 1.5 times more rubisco, okay, and still it might have only a very small effect, if any, on the harvest, 2% or something, because there are so many things that happen in between the stage where the plant takes ATP and uses that and carbon dioxide to make carbohydrate, that step, Rubisco does that step, and there's so many steps after that until when the plant produces the grain. Okay. So even if you have a big effect, you make a big change early on in this sequence, that change may get whittled away bit by bit until you get no change at all, and even could make it worse. So in general, it's probably better not to focus on individual genes, because what we really care about is the harvest and the plant health. So probably it's better to think about what's called phenotypes. The phenotype is some complicated word that just means the plant characteristics. So a phenotype of tallness, for instance, or a phenotype of having bigger seeds, or more seeds, or a phenotype of having curved leaves, or of having leaves that are near vertical or near horizontal. Those are phenotypes, okay? And so we should think about, because these phenotypes are things that have a more direct connection to the final harvest and to plant health, okay? And they may not have absolutely, I mean, having a vertical leaf or a horizontal leaf, there may still be some steps between having one or the other and having a better harvest, but it's certainly a lot closer connection between this phenotype of, say, leaves being vertical and the harvest. That's a much closer connection than the connection between some gene that in some way directly and indirectly influences the leaf angle and probably a million other things inside the plant, and therefore in some yet more remote way affects the harvest. So I'm saying maybe it's better, and not maybe, it's certainly better to think about phenotypes, at least if you're interested in the harvest, than in the genes. You just keep the genes in mind, but the genes are so far removed that from the harvest that probably you'll make more progress by thinking about the plant characteristics and traits. Another issue that makes things even harder is that plants are in some sense intelligent. As they grow, they reconfigure and reprogram themselves. They turn their genes on and off. So a plant that spends its first 2 weeks without much water may grow much differently and have a much different set of genes turned on than a plant that grows with plenty of water during its first 2 weeks. It's not just or a plant that grows in the lab will have different genes active than a plant that grows in a field. And then a plant that grows in one field may have have much different genes turned on than a plant in another field, I don't know, 50 kilometers away or even 1 kilometer away. It depends a lot on the weather, it depends a lot on the season, and also on the animals and the insects and the bacteria and fungi that this plant encounters as it's growing. And a plant can turn its genes on and off at any stage in its life cycle. So that means that if you change a gene, either through breeding or through genetic engineering, it isn't necessarily going to have any effect. The gene may be turned off in the field. It may, or if you demonstrate that it has some effect in your laboratory experiment, that doesn't tell you anything about whether it's going to have an effect while the plant is growing in the field, and if you grow the plant in 100 different fields, you may get much different effects. And in fact, it's not just whether it will have it may have an unplanned effect, okay, because other genes may be turned off and on, and So you might have thought you were breeding for height, and instead you get a change in the plant's ability to deal with cold weather. I don't know, just picking something out of a hat. Okay, so there are all sorts of side effects that can happen because every plant grows under different circumstances, and especially a plant that grows in the field grows under completely different circumstances than one in a lab. And because the instructions are completely rewired. So when you say you improve a plant, you're trying to improve a plant's ability to deal with some farming circumstance, or to grow, or to handle poor weather or poor soil or something. It's probabilistic. It's a probability that even if that perhaps it will improve the plant's harvest 2/3 of the time, okay, and some other fraction of the time it might not improve the harvest at all, and another fraction of the time it might actually make the harvest worse, depending on the circumstances that the plant grows up in. So another difficulty is it's hard to tell whether a plant actually is improved. Okay, if you want to know whether the harvest is improved, what you really need to do is grow the plant in the field, grow it all the way to harvest, carefully measure the harvest and see whether it's improved, and you need to do it in several places and in several years. Okay, this is just for one proposed change in the genes, one particular changing the genes either by breeding or by genetic engineering. Each and you'll probably want to try 100 or 1,000 different changes in the genes. So if you were to carry this out, you'd be growing 100 or 1,000 different what's called genotypes on many different farms in several different years. Now, this is very expensive and difficult, and I think in general people are not going to do that because it's so expensive and difficult. So you try to find shortcuts. Okay. So and another difficulty is, of course, a research program will go on for a decade or 20 years, and as you try different things, you'll see whether this year whether you have a better set of genes, a better plant or not, and then you try again next year. So you just keep on trying. So it's not once. So you want to take shortcuts, and so like one shortcut is to focus not so much on the genes but on the phenotypes. So maybe you try to identify something in the plant that seems to be associated with a better harvest. So maybe something that you can measure easily in a lab after 1 month of growth, instead of waiting 6 months and doing everything in a field. Okay, so you try to make some educated guesses, saying that maybe instead of carrying things forward finally to the harvest, maybe I can look at some other plant trait that is easier to measure and takes less time, and then maybe I can do things more quickly and more cheaply. You can do different levels of things that give you a guess, like maybe that give you an approximate guess. Maybe this species, this particular set of genes, will do better and give me some. So if I have 1,000 different breeds or sets of genes to check, 1,000 different varieties of this plant, maybe I'd like to be able to weed out 900 out of 1,000 without growing them on 1,000 different plots of land. So I'll pick some way of measuring the plant that I hope has something to do with the harvest, to weed out 9 out of 10 of them, and then I can go forward with the remaining 100 and do some more work. But it's all a kind of guesswork to make my life easier, and it's not absolutely reliable. So in general, the only thing you can really trust here is not whether a gene or anything else should produce a better harvest. Instead, you have to keep your eye on the final result that you want, which is a better harvest. And that has to be given priority at every step in your research. Otherwise, you'll just get lost and be pursuing some goal that has nothing, that's not productive at all. So I'll give an example for how that can work, and has worked, and very spectacularly. So it's the idea. There's been hundreds and hundreds of papers published about, and all sorts of money spent on developing, using genetic engineering this time, not breeding, using genetic engineering to produce drought-resistant plants. So the idea is that we get worse harvests in a drought, and we could get a better harvest if we produced a better plant that was able to flourish even when there's not enough water. So the people with the new techniques of gene sequencing and genetic engineering, they decide on a particular gene or 2 or 3 genes to target that they think will help the plant be able to harvest energy from sunlight even when there's not as much water. Then they take this altered plant and they grow it in their lab, and typically they don't grow it to full maturity. They'll grow a young plant, or maybe even a model plant, not a real grain, but some plant that people tend to use as models for genetic work. And then, like, one is tobacco, another one is called Arabidopsis. These are things that you can grow easily in a lab and grow for 30 days and see whether it looks good to you, whether it looks healthy, and then you can compare a version of it that was that's wild type or near wild type. In other words, you haven't done any genetic engineering on it. You can compare a plant grown that way to a plant where you have done the genetic engineering that you think should produce drought resistance. Okay, and then you take both plants, the one that is supposedly drought resistant, that's been genetically engineered, and the one that hasn't been genetically engineered. You grow it for a while, then you stop giving it water for a week or 2. Okay, so the soil dries out, and then you restore water and you see how the plant does. So, and often enough, and very often, what happens in these scientific studies is that the normal plants, the ones that weren't genetically engineered, they wither during the dry spell that you've made in the lab, and then they stay brown after you restart watering them. So they don't start growing again. Whereas the genetically engineered plants, they don't wither, and they don't turn brown, and they keep going. Or maybe they do turn brown and they re-green after you start watering them. Okay. So there have been hundreds of studies that have claimed that they had engineered using many different genes, many different studies, many genes, that they had engineered drought-resistant plants, because these plants didn't turn brown and they kept growing even when there was not enough water. Now there's some difficulties and why these studies just weren't valid. Okay. But a first difficulty is that if you deny enough water that a plant's survival is in question. If you give it so little water that it becomes difficult for it to even stay alive, okay, then necessarily what will happen is that its final yield, whether it lives or dies, will be very low, and the farmer who's farming this plant will be economically devastated. Okay, I'm quoting from a review by Sinclair, an author named Sinclair. So the point is that these labs and these genetic engineering research efforts, they were putting these plants under such large, they were giving these plants so little water that their lives were at stake. Okay, and if you were to do this, if a plant in the field or a crop in the field were to have that little water, it wouldn't matter whether the plant stays alive or not. It wouldn't give the farmer anything to speak of. The farmer just wouldn't get a crop. So if you really want to study something and produce something that's useful to a farmer, you want to study much more delicate regimens where you deny the plant some water, but it still has enough water one way or another, maybe groundwater or something stored underground, that it's not close to dying. It just doesn't have quite enough. But that's not what these studies typically did. But that's just a first remark. Another remark, and the real problem is that these plants weren't really drought resistant. They were crippled. If you have a plant that doesn't grow well, so it's small or something's wrong with it, okay, it's small, or maybe it has the plant equivalent of asthma, so it's gasping for breath and can't ever get enough, okay, scrawny little thing, weak little thing, then this plant will use less water. Because it uses less water, it will leave more water in the ground. So when you stop watering it, there will be more water in the ground, and it will take longer for it to run out of water. So these plants that were genetically engineered, they were crippled, they took less water from the ground, they didn't run out of water after a week or two, okay? Then you start watering it again, okay, it has water. It always did have water, okay, but it's crippled, it's small, and it's not going to give a good crop if it were really a crop plant. In general, these genetic engineering efforts to engineer drought-resistant plants, what they did was they took a plant that was already, its metabolism, the way that it uses nutrients and water and energy, was already near optimal, and the scientists picked one or another change to make to that metabolism, okay. And in general, because the metabolism was already near to optimal, any particular change that they made generally produced a genetically impaired plant, a crippled plant, and so it will cause the leaves to be too smaller than they would be otherwise. And for instance, and if the leaves are smaller than they would be otherwise, they'll harvest less sunlight, the plant won't grow as well, or maybe how it processes water and lets water in and out of the leaves will be different, or how it lets carbon dioxide out in and out of the leaves may be different. In any case, it'll interfere with the plant's growth. So huge amounts of money and scientific attention have been devoted to this sort of genetic engineering of drought resistance, and we've gotten basically nothing for it, for all the claims of improvements. So what could you do to improve drought resistance? Well, you could breed a plant, or you could try to get a plant to have deeper roots, so the roots would go further into the ground and get more water, or do whatever it takes to get for the plant to get better water access. Okay. Another thing that you could do is you could try to have the plant the crop as a whole, not the individual plant, but all the plants together, decrease their water loss. So you fiddle with you think of some bright idea that will help your whole field use less water. Another thing you could do is you could try to have your plants use less water when there is enough water, so they'll leave more water in the ground. And then when there's dry weather, there will be more water in the ground, and so they won't run out of water. So they conserve water when there's plenty of water, and then the water remains for the dry season. Also, when there's less water available, the chemical reactions, the metabolism, the whatever goes on inside the plant will change, which genes it turns on and off, and how it's processing the nutrients, the water, the carbon dioxide, and the rest. All that will change, and you could try to look at how it's changed and make sure it's still doing the best it can. It could be that a plant under water shortage may not be doing the best it can. Maybe it's just like it got a fever and a headache and went to bed. So you can look at improving that, and also you could see whether the plant has any special sensitivities and try to improve those. Okay, those are some ideas of things that you could do that would actually be likely to help the plant instead of targeting individual genes. But you notice that all of those things that I just mentioned were not gene focused. They were trait focused. They were phenotype sorts of things, like whether you have deep roots, what happens when there's plenty of water, how plants live around each other, and what they do with water when they're in a field together. Okay, all of those things are phenotypes. They're not focused on the original genes that underlie everything. Okay. So you might want to identify whether a plant has a good phenotype and breed for that. So what's the way forward for improving plants using either breeding or genetic engineering? Well, I think, again, I'm referring to a review article by Sinclair and a couple others. I've been drawing on a number of articles for this talk, and I'll be doing the same thing in the next episode. Okay, I generally, throughout these episodes, I've been drawing on hundreds and hundreds of articles. I generally don't give the names of individual articles because I don't dwell on one. But the next 5 minutes will be all based on this one review article by Sinclair, so I thought I'd mention it. So first of all, you want to confirm experimentally whether you have to identify a plant trait that you think is likely to help the harvest, and then you want to make sure, do some experimental validation in the field, growing plants with this particular trait, this particular phenotype, to see whether the harvest is actually increased, whether the yield, what's called the yield, which is the amount of grain that you get from the plant. So you change the trait, you measure whether the yield increases, and also you look at how much it costs to change that. What are the downsides? Then a next thing you need to do also, you also need to understand clearly which traits are changed by which genes. So you have to look at the plant traits, the phenotypes, and these traits depend not only on the genes but on the physical environment and also on the other biological things, the bacteria, the plants, the animals, the insects around the plant that will also affect and get genes turned on and off. Okay, the pests and the beneficial things in the soil. And then another thing you'll have to do in order to have some success here is you have to have many disciplines working together people with different insights into the plant. So there will be crop physiologists. That means people who understand the organs inside of a plant, how a plant is built, and how and the structure. You need agronomists, which are scientists who study how plants grow in the field, and what makes them grow well. And you need breeders, people who know how to analyze genetics and take two different versions of, say, broccoli and breed them together to make some special version of broccoli. Okay, those are breeders. And then if you want to do gene engineering, genetic engineering, then you also need geneticists. Okay, and then of course you probably want farmers, because they'll be the people who will supposedly benefit from this improved plant. And also you want people who understand numbers and understand money. And then a fourth thing you need is long-term commitment. The research efforts that have improved plants successfully have generally taken 15 years or more. So these are things that require sustained commitment, and it just doesn't come fast. You need a certain faithfulness to it. Okay, and then what you do, if you have all four of these things, you know that you showed clearly that the trait actually increases the yield. You understand the connection between that trait and genes, and you have many disciplines, scientists from many disciplines working together on the long term, 15 years or more. Then you see examples. We do have some examples of some crops that were improved. Okay, so let me give an example. I'll give several. One is soybeans. Somebody found that the soybean breeds that they had, if the amount of water in the soil was a little bit low, so not enough to kill the plant, but a little bit low, then the plant wasn't as efficient in using nitrogen. Okay, it wasn't making full use of the nitrogen that was in the soil when it was having to cope with a little less water than it wanted. And the way that they could tell is that they took the soil with a little less water and they overloaded it with lots of nitrogen, and they saw that the plant did better, which told them they knew that if that soil had plenty of water, that the plant wouldn't have needed any more nitrogen. It didn't need any more nitrogen except for if this water level was reduced a little bit. So how to get your plant to be making full use of the nitrogen even when it doesn't have quite enough water. Okay, and so there was a long research effort that went into this, and finally, as a result of that, they were able to get, in somewhat dry soils, they were able to get a 5 to 20% improvement in the yield, because they had somehow bred these plants to make a little better use of the nitrogen. So this took 15 some years, and the overall improvement in a particular scenario where there's plenty of nitrogen, but not too much, and where there's a little bit less water than one would want, the overall improvement in yield was 5 to 20%, depending on the year and the dryness of the soil. Now, keep in mind that this is 5 or 20% better than other breeds on the same soil in the same year. Okay. Now these breeds are still, because the soil is a little bit dry, are probably giving a lower harvest than they would if the soil had plenty of water. Okay. So they're a little bit dry. The water's a little bit dry. They're giving a worse harvest, but the harvest isn't as bad as it would be with a normal breed. Okay, the normal breed on that same soil, that same little bit dry soil, is not making as good use of nitrogen, and so it gives you an even poorer harvest than the poor harvest that you're getting with this improved breed. Okay, so here's another example. Cowpeas, it's a kind of pea, a kind of bean, and And it was found that if at night the temperature was too warm, say 30 degrees Celsius, that these cowpeas would not go through the sexual process that results in producing actual peas. They'd never get around to producing beans. And so there was some breeding that went on, again over a period of like 15 years, and it was and they came up with a breed that was able to produce peas even in places where the nighttime temperature was 30 degrees. That's an improvement. That's 100% improvement, of course, for a particular breed in a particular hot year. Okay. A third example. Okay. People have bred wheat to deal with somewhat dry soils a little better, so it gives a 10% better yield than it would than other breeds do in somewhat dry soils. Okay, so this is sort of an insurance thing that most of the time maybe you would expect the soil to have enough water, but in a dry year you'll get a 10% better, you'll get a worse yield than in a year with plenty of water, but your yield will be 10% better than it would be if you were using a normal breed. So overall, the sorts of improvements, you have to do a lot of work, you have to have a lot of people working together, you have a lot of and the genes don't give you they may give you some shortcuts, but overall it's just a hard thing to figure out how to improve a plant, even improving for a particular case like dry weather or a little bit warm weather, and then you get improvements of 10 or 20% in the yield. Okay, that's just to give you so it's hard, and you may not get a great benefit. 10 or 5, 10, 20%. Sometimes, not every season. And so I want to end with some discussion about genetic engineering versus breeding, which and right now I'm not going to cover the morality or ethics of genetic engineering versus breeding. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the next episode. Okay. Right now I just want to talk about pros and cons of one versus the other and how they would fit together. So a pro for genetic engineering is that it allows you to make huge changes in a plant that would require many changes of breeding. Okay, you can just go in and you can say I want to change this particular thing, and you can just do it. Okay, you don't have to fiddle around with crossing plants with another and with each other and growing them and then crossing them again or anything like that. You just do it. Okay. But there are many cons against genetic engineering that are actually pushed towards breeding instead of genetic engineering. So one of the cons is that we don't have enough info about all the genes and what their effects are and how they work together, and so it's impossible at this stage, and is likely to remain impossible for a long time to come. It's impossible to have any clear and confident idea about what the final consequences will be for a plant, for plant health. So you change some gene, and you may have an idea of one particular effect that gene would have, okay, but maybe not even a final effect that it would, say, harvest more carbon dioxide, but not what the final effect will be on the plant's health. There are too many steps removed. Okay, and then there are all sorts of other effects that may come from your that you hadn't anticipated. In fact, there are likely to be all sorts of other effects from your gene engineering. So you can't predict what your genetic engineering will do. That's a little bit different from breeding, because if you have a plant that if you have a breed that has green leaves, has very dark green leaves, and another plant has lighter green leaves, you breed them together, maybe you can expect to have somewhere in between. Not a dead plant, for instance. Another con is that whenever you do genetic engineering, you're basically making a leap in the dark. Maybe that's a repeat of my last point. Since you don't know what to expect, you're just jumping and hoping you end up in some good place. Okay? And more often than not, you don't end up in a good place. And another con is just that there are so many steps between changing a specific protein using a specific gene, and then so many steps up to having a healthier plant that grows better, and then steps beyond that to having a crop that grows better. And you just don't know which changes to which proteins will help. Okay. So overall, it looks like, I think, that genetic engineering will not be an alternative to breeding. It's not like we just don't need to breed plants anymore. Now we can just go and fiddle with their genes directly. In fact, it will depend on breeding. Everything that we've developed until now about figuring out how to cross a plant and cross it again, how to figure out its phenotypes, its traits, how to improve them bit by bit over 15 years. All that experience in science, we'll still be having to use it, okay? Because with genetic engineering you're flying blind, and you need a lot more information, and that information is only going to come from the science that we've already developed for breeding plants. So genetic engineering is going to be part of the breeding toolbox. Okay, it's not going to be an alternative to breeding. It's not going to be better than breeding. It's not even going to do half of the work. It's going to do a fraction of the work, and it's going to be used when it's useful, or when it helps the breeding along. So somebody is breeding a plant for some particular goal, and they think, okay, well, it would be nice if it would, and after doing a lot of research they begin to get some insight, well, it would be nice if this particular thing changed, and maybe I could save some time if instead of crossing and recrossing a plant 10 times, maybe I could get my friend over there in the genetics laboratory to make a specific change, and let's see whether that works. Okay, it's going to be subsidiary to breeding. It's going to be a helper. It's going to be a servant to breeding. That's genetic engineering's role. And since genetic engineering is only going to do part of the work and a fraction of the work for improving plants, it's not going to make a big difference in how long it takes to improve a plant. Most of the life cycle of plant improvement is already in place, and stage after stage after stage of trying to identify what you want to improve and what plant traits will give that, and then trying to find some good breeds or some good genotypes that take you a step in that direction, and trying to breed them together to give you something that has a better plant trait and that still yields decent harvests. Okay, well, genetic engineering doesn't just fits into there. It doesn't change most of those steps, so it'll still take us 15 years or more to develop a new improved plant. So this episode was about genetic improvement of plants and why it's hard to do, and in the end about why genetic engineering doesn't make that much difference in the hardship and the difficulty and the time required to get a better plant, and that if we do improve a plant, it'll be for some specific circumstance, say farmland in California on a hot year, okay, and the overall improvement will be probably 10 or 20%, if that, sometimes. And that's the sort of thing we can expect from improving our plants at this point. So in the next episode, I'll be talking about some specific genetics ideas that people have been thinking about how they could, or what you could improve in a particular. In the previous episodes, I talked about how a plant goes about harvesting sunlight, and in particular how it uses Rubisco to harvest carbon dioxide, and then and all the things that go into that. And so you can think about, okay, I want to change this particular bit of the chemistry, okay. And so I'll be discussing some of those proposed improvements and things that people have been trying. For instance, trying to see if you could make a plant that concentrates more carbon dioxide near the Rubisco, or changes its leaf angle. Well, I've already mentioned leaf angle in this episode, but these are the sorts of things that people try. Now, I'll try to give an overview of what those are and how far we've gotten with them, and then finally I'll wind up with some comments about what's the likelihood of how much change in the next 100 years, and what are the ethics of this all, especially of genetic engineering. So with that, I wish you a wonderful next week, and I just keep coming back, and I hope you like this, and just keep coming back.